Hi there, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to Reading Aristotle's Politics. Today we return to Book 4, Chapter 9. We're looking at Chapter 9, which is a discussion. Well, we're ending up with the discussion of the examination of the mixed, not that I say mixed regime, but aristocracy and if 5, 6, and 7, sorry, 4, 5, and 6, we're looking at the democratic regimes. 7 and 8 tended to look at the question of the remaining regimes, which were, which is technically, he promised to look at the remaining regimes starting in chapter uh, 7. Okay, and the remaining regimes, he said basically there were 5 regimes. That is, except for kingship. He said he left off already, and aristocracy, but therefore the aristocracy would deal elsewhere. That's book 3 dealt with the kind of discussion of kingship. Book 7 and 8 will deal with the so-called regime that would you pray for. So therefore, so-called aristocracy, and therefore we have the so-called aristocracy, the regime called regime, and um, then tyranny. And tyranny will be discussed in chapter 10. Um, so therefore, we got 6, 7, 8. I'm sorry, 7, 8, and 9 really deals with the question of so-called aristocracy and discussion of aristocracy, and the so-called. Well, I mean, let's say every most translations will translate it as polity, but as I said before, when you see polity here, and Lord does this, this is politeia, and politeia is the same thing as regime. Um, when the translators do this, they're interpreting the text. Okay, they're not you're, and therefore you're missing. If you're looking at the Greek, you would say, "Well, this is politeia. Why is he calling this?" I mean, what is disturbing in the Greek, or would be asking you a question: Why is he calling something the same name he calls the label, like saying of the dogs, of the type of dogs, this type of dog is called dog. Okay, and therefore you assume that, well, this is really the thing that is most typically dog. Okay, you understand the problem here. An animal, a type of animal called animal. Okay, a species. In other words, a species called species. This is in fact. We have to remember Aristotle is a biologist. His famous works on animals and type of animals, and he's using the kind to understand the form of politeia, which is, remember, politeia, the forms of government regimes. We said politeia typically means. I followed the thing that Strauss and others of his students called regime. Um, some don't like that. Okay, the typical translation of politeia was constitution, but that is problematic because we see constitution today, we think of legal document, we think of formal institutional things, and it's more than that. Constitution usually meant, remember the joke of constitution is how's about your health, right? Um, your strength, your character. The Constitution was originally in English itself. So therefore, but modern English, in our way we look at it, we reduce it to the term of being a legal form, an institutional document. So therefore, this is problematic, and it's more than that. The politeia means not only that, it also means the way of life, the character, the understanding of justice, uh, uh, the unwritten laws as well as the written laws. Okay, so the written habits and a way of life as well. So it's a broader concept. So therefore, regime is okay. It's preferable to constitution, but there's some people might say a more neutral term like political system. That's too neutral, a little bit so much that goes too far to this kind of okay. We think political system is so benign and it looks at process, more like process. A term that was constantly used was government, but that is misleading also. So politeia is this weird word, and then he calls this, and we're going to be dealing with aristocracy, so called, and then politeia. So therefore, this is we should call the this weird these chapters 7, 8, and 9 have this. We looked at this right, and we had discussion of the well-off and this idea of balancing. Right now, let's continue here. This is like he continues with this right here. He says, chapter 9: in what manner so-called regime, remember, comes into being besides democracy and oligarchy, and how should it be established? So therefore, he asked a question about how should this regime called regime be established, right? We shall speak. This is the interesting point. This is where people say, oh, no, this is the point we're about establishing governments. I'm going to argue that this is not really addressed here. We'll be seeing this, that the establishment of, in fact, if polity is talked about establishment of polity, right? Um, only polity is established with regime. Okay, the regime itself is. I think argue the regime itself is being talked. The establishment of a regime, of establishing specific regimes. I will argue that is book 6. So he promises to talk about what regime is best for what city, but we don't get that really. We get this discussion of this so-called regime called regime and its establishment, which might actually be the question of establishing any regime. Pardon me. Oh God, you saw that? That's no. I shouldn't have done that. So we're just speaking now in conformity what has been said. At the same time, it will be clear also what it is that defines democracy and oligarchy. For the distinction between these must be grasped, and a combination then of these, then made out of these, taking from each a tally as it were. Now, this is 40. Look at note 40. I think this is interesting. A tally or symbolon is one of two halves of a token, right? This is the idea. The symbion is two halves of a token, which contracting parties broke between them for the purpose of identification. So this word symbion was a symbol where a contracting party took a thing, broke it, and this was a symbol of the agreement. Well, here's the opposite. Two different things will take this thing as their symbol. Okay, this is what's interesting here for this is the kind of almost opposite, and the idea that this was the thing, this tally, that something like this is being used, something that is represented as contracts, gives, and this is why I think this is the question: is this a contract or is this something more than a contract? Okay, this there are three defining principles of this combination or mixture. One is to take the elements of the legislation of each, as for example concerning adjudication. In oligarchies, they are arraigned to fine the well-off if they do not take part in adjudicating, and provide no pay for the poor, while in democracies they provide pay for the poor and do not fine the well-off. Okay, so he says concerning adjudication and judiciaries, they give pay to the poor and don't fine the well-off. Now, oligarchies, they would fine no pay for the poor, but they penalize the well-off if they don't do it. Okay, that's an oligarchy procedure. Now you think, wait a minute, you mean actions against the well, a law punishing the rich is a form of oligarchic institution, forcing them to participate. One would think that may be democratic, but no. A contrary, this is a weird aspect. That's oligarchy. When giving the money to the poor to pay, that's clearly democratic. That's it. Okay, inciting, but this is again the juries, right? So in okay now, and they didn't, but they democracies give pay to that, but don't find the well off. What is common to What is common to and a mean, a middle point, right? Mean between these. Now, he means here in a way different than mean as he uses it in the ethics. The mean in the ethics is not an average. The mean in the ethics is a, a peak, but one that is not. It's between two extremes, both an extreme of excess and an extreme of a deficiency. Here, mean is kind of more like a middle point, of simply not a middle point, but also kind of an averaging out. Um, um, and this is why it's very interesting here in that sense. Um, in other words, what we find here in common mean between these two, there is to have both arrangements. So pay, in other words, you pay the people and penalize the wealthy. Okay, so this is kind of a middle point that connects aspects of this, right? And hence it is characteristic of a regime, right, or polity, which has the so-called regime, which is a mixture formed of both. Now, I'm going to always argue, and this has always been my interpretation, that all regimes are mixtures. Because look at how we talked about this. The city is composed of parts, and regimes are parts. And the different parts of the city, different parts, are going to incline to different things. The rich are the rich or the well educated or the well off in the city are always going to and the notables are always going to push either something oligarchic in character, either pure oligarchy of wealth or an oligarchy of so-called aristocracy, which is usually education, right? So, therefore, old money. In other words, the difference between aristocracy and an oligarchy, a so-called aristocracy and oligarchy, is basically older families. Families are better, longer established families, newer, not new money, old money. A pure oligarchy based on wealth, family may be important, but it's not going to have it's going to be an equality between old families and new families. Where something is more aristocratic is that old families will have more authority. Okay, the educated, the ones who are better born. Right. This is the traditional conception of a more what we call so-called Aristotle would call here so-called aristocracy. Um, all regimes, therefore, because they're composed of different parts that push, will always be blended. This is why the nature of the polis is not a holistic entity. The nature of the polis or political community is a construct of discrete parts. And each of the various parts in the city are going to have an inclination towards a particular type of regime. That the multitude, the people, the multitude, the plethos, will either be of a character that will be determined like different types of regimes. The democratic regimes, popular regimes. The farm. We talked about the farming classes, the laboring classes, and the tradesmen, the guildsmen, the physical laborers. All these groups are going to lead to different types of democracy. The first democracy to the last democracy, as we'll see in Book 6, and we saw in Book 4 already, right? That therefore this idea that blending is not to say that blending is only specific to this regime called regime is a lie in that sense. It's misleading. Yes, blending is tied to politeia, but all politeia, okay? So there's going to be blending, and therefore you can't escape blending. There's never going to be a pure one regime in this sense. This idea that we will have a pure democracy only with democratic elements is not true, because the city is composed of elements that have tendencies. It doesn't mean that they will have those elements may not be authoritative or having a power or that much influence in the society, particularly the ruling part. They may have very little influence on the polituma, the ruling part, but they're still there, and their influence and their place within the community and their place in the larger network of things that the ruling part has to respond to. And sometimes they might have to keep them willing and not enter into coercion with them to merely coerce them to do what is good, what the ruling part wants. They might have to, make them do something. They might have to compromise. Might have to persuade them. Might have to do this through influence, buy them with something, right? But that thing that they buy them with or persuade them with might actually lead to something that moves the regime in a direction toward a different direction in the long term. Like even certain policy choice like this says, therefore, blending is always present in the sense in a politeia. So therefore, to say the mixed regime, no, all regimes are mixed. So it's not that mix only in the so-called regime called regime, or how the translation calls polity is where mixture happens. No, in all regimes are in mixture, and therefore to discuss about the regime called regime is really to talk generically about all regimes, okay, and not specifically about a specific regime. That's the trick. By speaking of it as a specific type of regime, it's kind of like a trick, and that we're forced to realize it's a trick in a sense that we fail to understand that that any regime that tries to be a perfectly one holistic will become not work. All regimes, and particularly the best regime, a regime that will be balanced, will always have to blend itself to some degree. Okay, and this is the point that he's trying to get here, and I think this is how we should understand this. So let's return. We left it around this point. He says, this then is one mode of conjoining them, right? It's conjoining of this. Another is to take the mean between the arrangement of each, right? Again, the middle point of these each. So, for example, in the case that they attend the assembly on a basis on no assessment or at all, or a very small one, and on another on the basis of a very large assessment. What is common here is that neither of these, but what is common here is neither of these, but the mean between the assessments. Okay. A third is a selection of both arrangements, taking some from the oligarchic law and some from the democratic. I mean, for example, it is held to be democratic for offices to be chosen by lot. Oligarchic tend to have elected, and democratics not to do it on the basis of assessment. Oligarchics to do it on the basis of assessment. So we're going to elect people for offices. The election is oligarchic. Lottery is democratic. Lottery is that everyone's equal and therefore anyone can do it, right? But then the question of, well, okay, that's the selection mechanism. Okay, that to select by election is oligarchic. To select by lottery is democratic. Now the question is another aspect of selection. The question of, well, the candidates who can be eligible. So how we select them and who can be eligible are two questions. One eligibility is based on assessment. An assessment usually means their wealth, their status, who they are. Now, here, assessment literally means based on an assessment of their wealth, but it could be also their character, right? We can say we don't like you. We want someone of a good character, a good family, not a bad family. We don't want this kind of person. Now, think of the character question. We think of the character question today in politics and say, oh yeah, that's values. But again, that's what the term value is about money, right? This is where it comes from. The value of something is worth, right? So therefore, the moral questions in the economic class are tied. Questions. This is if anyone who wants to assess someone based on some characteristic is engaging in an oligarchic principle. This even means, do I want gay people or not? Okay. I want black person. I want a minority. I want something like this. That's an oligarchic. Anything that we start defining people based on their different statuses, that we prefer one over another because of another reason. But wait a minute. But that is, again, the few, anything that will protect a minority at the expense of the majority is oligarchic. It's an anti-democratic principle. Democracy means the rule of the majority. Bye bye. Okay, the majority wins. Let's have no foolishness about this. And this is one of the stupid things that democracy means minority rights. No, it don't. The concept that you protect the minority is an oligarchic principle. That a minority can veto the majority or block it or restrain it is a oligarchic principle. Understand that in that characteristic, right? So he continues here, right? The assessment of this. It goes, it is characteristic of all aristocracy and regime, therefore. Again, he mixes, again, we thought we're talking about, he constantly, in these three chapters, constantly keeps on intermixing oligarchy, not oligarchy, I mean, aristocracy, so called aristocracy. He also does this trick. He so called aristocracy, or so called aristocracy. Okay, he keeps on flipping it in and out, so we don't know what is this? Is this aristocracy? I thought we were supposed to be talking about. We talked about aristocracy already in book 7 and 8. Okay, I thought we were talking about so-called aristocracy here, the things that we call aristocracy, and then same thing with the regime. He speaks of regime as regime, but then so-called regime, right? Again, it's this flopping back and forth. This in fact, confusing of both these terms together and lumping them together, which is something we should pay attention to also here. So he goes, it's characteristic for the aristocracy in a regime, therefore, to take an element of each, from oligarchy making officers elected, and from democracy not doing it on the basis of assessment, right? So that's, again, this is one mixture. This is a blending that we say we're going to make officers elected, okay? That's how so therefore, the so-called regime is kind of mixture of different elements of here. Therefore, this is interesting. That therefore, the pure type, democracy and oligarchies are pure types. It almost seems to argue, and that this aristocracy and regime, this thing called regime, are not pure. They have no real characteristic of their own. They are basically a kind of mean mixture, mean. They are a derivative of the pure types, a blending and derivative of the pure types. Now that is interesting. To argue that there is therefore two types of regimes. In the purest sense, there's only two types of regimes, we could maybe say. There is the regime of the people, the multitude, and the regime of the notables, or the few, the many and the few. These are the pure types, like the two winds he talked about earlier. The two winds, the two types. There are these two fundamental regimes, and that these aristocracy, it's not that. Therefore, this idea that there's five, there's really two, and the three. Okay, there is a third, and we'll talk about that in the next chapter, right? So let's go through here that the third two types, and then the blending of things, right? The manner of mixing them then is this: the defining principle of a good mixture of democracy and oligarchy is that it should be possible for for the same regime to be spoken as either a democracy or an oligarchy. In other words, that it can be spoken of either. No one knows where it is, right? It is clear that it is because the mixture is fine. Again, fine here is beautiful, kalos, noble, fine, beautiful, kalos, beautiful, noble, good. One. Um, that those who speak of it do it in this way. The mean too is of this sort, the middle point. Each of the extremes is revealed in it. So the extremes of both these two regimes, the oligarchy, are both there. Okay. This just this happened in the case of the Spartan regime. But again, remember, he's not. He says this happens in the Spartan regime. Remember, he's very critical of the Spartan regime. It's not this statement here should make us wonder: is he going to argue that this is a good thing? Everyone argues that this is a wonderful thing, but wait a minute, why would he then give the point that this is what happens in the case of the Spartan regime? And he has a very negative critique of the so-called regimes of the regimes that are held to be. The Spartan is his least favorite, least praised. It was Carthage, Crete, and Sparta. Crete, the non-Greek one, the Carthage, are the one most praised. It is a oligarchy, but one of an oligarchy, a multitude of an oligarchy. Okay, the multitude is oligarchic. Um, the least praised is Sparta, where the multitude is not oligarch. It's a weird regime, right? It is a kind of a mixed regime, and he's the most critical of this, which is kind of the most mixed regime. So now let's continue here, right? This is the many attempt to speak of it as if it were a democracy on account of the fact that the arrangement has many democratic elements. Okay? In the first place, for example, as far as the rearing of children is concerned, those of the wealthy are reared in a similar fashion as those poor, and they are educated in such a manner such that the children of the poor can also afford it. It is similar as well in the it is similar as well in the age following, and when they become men, in the same approach it is followed. For a wealthy person is in no way marked off from a poor one. The sustenance they get in the common messes is the same for all, and the rich, same for all, and the dress of the rich of a sort that any of the poor could also provide for themselves. So therefore, this idea that it looks at, but remember, it was left to you to pay for the masses. So, and if you couldn't afford the masses, going to the masses, like you couldn't afford the contribution to the mass, you don't attend, you don't participate in the mass, you don't participate in public offices. You can't hold office, you can't do things. You can't participate in the regime. So you need to contribute. So therefore, to be able to, even though everything is the same in that thing, if you can't contribute to it, you can't pay your contribution. You don't belong. That's the critic he can back in book 2. Remember that. So everything he says here, he highlights the positive and ignores the negative critique, right? Um, and like the idea that it has the perception of being equal. Further, it seems democratic by the fact that of the two greatest offices, one is elected by the people, okay, or elected by the people, but elected, not a lottery. While they take part in the other, before they elect the senators and take part in the board of the F wars, right? The F wars. On the other hand, others call oligarchic on account of its having many oligarchic elements. For example, all the offices are chosen by election and none by lot. A few have authority over cases with penalties of death and exile, and many other things. So few have authority. Very limited. In other words, the larger assembly doesn't decide these big questions of life and death. Remember, America. How does America deal with juries? It's lottery. The English system of juries, the Anglo-Saxon common law model, it's a small body, but it's randomly selected of the neighbor community. It's randomly selected by lottery. This is weird. This is important to understand this. Therefore, this is the power of life and death, exile. Okay, that's the interesting thing. It's the people. Yes, it is the people taken from the people. many randomly selected by lottery of the community, of the peers, of their things. So this is an interesting thing. So that's how you can understand this, and that's it. And that's why oligarchy would be only that it's not the people select, it's chosen, people chosen, and it's best chosen from a few. And a few have authority over cases with penalties of death and exile, and many other such things too. In a regime that is finely mixed, remember this is why it's interesting. This is why we should not do polity. We should always have the confusion whether he's talking about the specific regime or all regimes. In a regime that is finely mixed, the regime should be held to be both and neither. So we talk about what? Here, this is talking about blending. Chapter 9 is again hitting on the question of blending, of the nature of the blending that is in any regime, all regimes in that sense. And it should be preserved through itself, not from outside. Through itself, not because those wishing it preservations are in the majority. Now, this is 41. This is a bracketed with bracketing etheron with terot, so therefore they bracket it means that they treat it as not though it's the same thing. Okay, whatever. This is okay. I have to go back here. Where is it? No. Sorry. Okay, go back. What is going on here? I went too far, and I hate doing this when I get. Oh yeah, we woo, something happened with the fonts. Look, we get this. Where's 40? Where's 40? Where's something happened with the fonts? We got to. Okay, this is 41 majority. And since it might be seen as, it might be the case even in a base regime, but not good regime. In other words, we should be preserving itself not from outside, but through itself, because not because of those wishing it preservation are the majority, right? And he brackets this point since it might seem it since this might be the case even in a base regime. Okay, but because none of the parts of the city generally would wish to have another regime. In other words, that all the parts of the city wants to preserve the current form and don't want to change it. So therefore, that's in other words, the major. In other words, not the only the majority wants it, but all the parts want it. They're happy with it. When the parts are happy, there's no move. We're talking about this will change, right? In other words, this is there's no move or pushing to change the nature of the regime. Therefore, this is why we have to understand change in this sense. This is why when we look at Book 5, I prefer change than revolution. We talk about metabole. It's wants no one wants to have a revolution in that sense. No one wants to have it alter. They want to keep the regime. None of the parts of the city generally would wish to have another regime. So it's not only the majority, it holds together because the majority wants it, but because all the parts of the city wants it. And that's a stable regime. Okay, this is the definition of stability, then, therefore. It's not about, what's interesting here is this chapter is not about really establishing a specific type of regime, but really the question of stability, of how do you achieve a stable regime in that sense? And how do you have a regime that is able to preserve itself? Okay, this is what blending is about. Blending is not about a specific regime; it's about all political regimes. I'm going too long to wind on. He goes, "Oh, you're going to keep me on talking this way." Why? Okay, let's go. Let's continue where we left off. Right. In what manner regime should be established? It's the question. In what manner regime should be society. And similarly, the regimes termed aristocracies has now been spoken of. Has he? Have we? He ends it right here, right on this weird thing. He ends it with this. We've spoken about this, or we've dealt with this question. How we should establish how what manner regime called regime should be established, and similarly the regime termed aristocracy. This has been spoken. What kind of has it really been promised? Has he ever really talked about establishing this? He talked about the blending of things. This is why I think this chapter is a very perturbing and very it should and this is why translating it in translating deciding what means polity and what doesn't mean polity, translating which form of politeia means polity and which no, leave it alone. Let the confusion let only by confronting the what this thing do we see that he's talking about not a specific regime but rather all regimes, and that therefore the structure of the nature of the regime is this competing forces of these forces, of the forces that compose it, and that the forces that compose any city is composed of parts. These parts are composed of different varieties. They, as he said, they're composed. It's a composite whole, not a unitary whole. It's composed of the multitude and the notables, right? But the multitudes have different ways of life, and the multitude and the notables have different ways of life, and the ways of life will point towards certain types of things. The different parts of the city, right? Go back to book 4, chapter 4, all those parts. Look at the parts. Then look at what he said earlier about the far, tie together the different streams of what he said. The two dominant forces, that of the, he played the two. That is, we really speak of there's only two regimes, two forces, that of the multitude and that of the notables, that of the many and that of the few. Okay, remember few ogoi, many hoi polloi, the plathos, the many. We have this tendency in other words, and as we said, the mixing. This is very interesting. Aristocracy is supposed to should be talked about in book 6. So-called aristocracy, but he doesn't treat. He never treats regime autocracy really in these 3 chapters here. Has never really he did the oligarchy and democracy and oligarchy get separate treatments and then gets recounted, right? One and one. But democracy gets first, and its account gets interrupted by a discussion of the parts, right? So notice the structure of what is going on here. There's a structure of the argument. The structure of the argument is, and then we get to this blurring, this separateness of these two, the remaining regimes. And then now we'll see the next thing, tyranny talked about. And that's a short chapter. Okay. Which is very interesting. Well, so we'll stop here. If you have any questions or comments, please put them below. If you liked it, like it. And share it with a friend. It'd be nice. If you didn't like it, don't like it, criticize me. Say, oh, I don't like the way you said. Why the hell are you doing this? Why are you using the text and not, okay, just give me criticisms. It's good. Maybe you know something I don't know. Okay, teach me. What else? If you have subscribed already, thank you. Please encourage others to do this. I like to grow. If you have not subscribed, do subscribe, please. It helps me to help this channel grow. I need to get over 1,000 something so I can finally get some monetization. Right? You got interrupted at the end. Second. So monetization is important. Why? This is where my next point. If you free subscribe, because as it grows the channel, we get monetized. Helps things. But Another thing you can do is you can follow me on social media below if you want to follow me. Another thing you can do is you want to help. YouTube is charging us now for a size of our channels. I'm finally big enough and I'm producing enough that I had to pay each month something. Not had to go to the second rate, not the first one. I'm going to be and it kind of pushing me. I'm on nearly 50% already, and I keep on this level of production. I will be forced to get into the higher thing. So it's just Patreon and subscribe star is a way to do this. I know no one's done it. I haven't got notifications. I understand that. Another way you can do it is go buy my book. It's the link is below. It's my thing. This current book is this is thing I this is like the summer. It's the notebook on Aristotle's politics. It is a study guide, a working book, not a commentary, not interpretation. It's basically what it is. It cliff notes, not a mere summary. It has like chapter every book of the politics. It goes through and it looks at the politics text from the point of view of trying to understand it and guide you through it, like a study guide. And it's a workbook book in that sense. It allows you to take notes, add more notes to your thing. It helps guide you through the text. And so useful, particularly doing what we're doing here. Okay, that's it. I hope we'll see next chapter, chapter 10 with tyranny. So we'll stop here and see you next time. Bye bye.